Good morning, everyone. How are you all? We are here today to talk about modules in Title IV, which is an endless topic that cannot be covered in 75 minutes, so we're going to limit it today to only talk about Pell recalculations. And this is a presentation that's in a kind of a long series of presentations that Greg Martin and I, and you see his name up on the screen right now. Greg Martin is an analyst in the Office of Post-Secondary Education and an ex-training officer. And he and I have been presenting on modules at every Federal Student Aid Conference, probably going back 7 years. And we always present on modules, it seems, but we try to kind of change the focus from conference to conference. And what we found is in the last couple of conferences, the great majority of our questions that were asked in our sessions were about Pell recalculations, which we had a slide or two on, and we decided this year to expand and only talk about Pell recalculations and how you can encounter some interesting scenarios in modules that affect how a Pell may or may not get recalculated. So I said Greg was a policy analyst. I am a training officer, not an ex-training officer, as my friend Greg is, and I'm a training officer in the Dallas, Texas regional office, and I've worked for the department for 24 years and been a training officer for 12. Greg is double booked today. He was supposed to be here, but he's also presenting on gainful employment as we speak. He's co-presenting with an individual in that session, and he chose to be with the person who was the higher pay grade, which I think it ought to be the other way around, but who am I at my pay grade? So what we'll do today is we'll talk about 5 different student scenarios, and of course that's just scratching the surface of what you might encounter at your schools. Every one of the scenarios we'll look at, of course, given the topic we just delineated, will be about someone who has a federal Pell Grant and whether or not that federal Pell Grant has to be recalculated based on the student's change in his or her enrollment status. Now, it is often the case that schools will discover that a Pell Grant recalculation is necessary at the same time that they discover that the student has withdrawn. And that's not what this session is about. That's a whole different 75-minute session that we will not have time to talk about today. So we're going to limit our discussion today to Pell recalcs, but just know that a Pell recalc can often be done at the same time you're doing a return, and it's very important to remember you do the Pell recalc first. Then you would do a return after that, and the return would be based on the recalculated Pell amount because we think of that as the correct Pell Grant after the recalculation is done. We're going to discuss the very important difference between an initial Pell calculation and a Pell recalculation. That syllable re is a very important difference between these two things, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. When I first started talking about Pell recalculations, and especially in a module environment, I didn't talk about this, and a school would ask about it in every session, so I just decided to sort of throw it out there in the very beginning. Some of you choose to pay a student, especially in a modular environment, but not necessarily in a modular environment, you pay the student as they start each module. These modules all residing within one Title IV payment period. And that's okay, but that's not what we're talking about here today. We're assuming that the school does what we would think of as probably the more normal process of making the disbursement in its entirety to the student based on what they believe the student is going to do, because we're looking at modules. Those modules may be in the future in this same payment period. So just be aware, you may do this. You may take a disbursement for the payment period and pay it out in a word I use, installments. I say the school is paying the disbursement in installments. That's not an official ed term. It's not in regulation or the handbook, but that's the way I think about it. You've got this set amount of money that's the disbursement for the payment period, but you choose to pay it more than once in installments. And that's fine, but that's not a recalc. If you've taken, as we see on this slide, that you've dispersed half of the amount at the beginning and half of the amount later on, We're not changing the student's enrollment status unless that has indeed happened. But if we thought of this student as full-time from the beginning of the payment period, they are reported to COD as full-time. We've just taken their full-time disbursement and cut it into 2 halves or 3/3 or however you want to disperse it. It is not a recalc in this set scenario. Another thing about this is that there is no requirement to do this. As a matter of fact, we don't even recommend that you pay this in installments, but schools that do it in installments seem to like to do it. It's not wrong to do it. You really want to have very carefully and clearly written policies and procedures that say how you're doing this, and it is your choice to do it. There is no ed requirement to ever pay a disbursement for a payment period in installments. This is just a graphic pointing out what a school like this would be doing. Here we have a fall semester, the blue box, that is the payment period. There's 2 modules, the 2 green boxes, and the $ indicates when the money is being released to the student. So here we have this school is taking the disbursement for the entire fall and making it in 2 installments, one at the beginning of Module 1 and one at the beginning of Module 2. But if this school was aware that this was a 12-hour student from the beginning of fall, they would be dealing with a full-time student, and they would calculate it as a full-time disbursement, full-time enrollment status. They just choose to pay it out in 2 installments. So I said we would talk a little bit about initial Pell calculations. Initial means exactly what it says. It's the first Pell calculation that you do. At some schools, that might be the last one you do, but at many schools, it's the first of many calculations that you might do for a given Pell recipient. You want to document the date that you conduct you perform an initial Pell calculation. But the earliest that date can be, and be official, is the date of a receipt of an ed-produced EFC. That can come from a variety of sources. Some of those are at the bottom of the slide. An EFC could be from the student's SAR or the ICER that we've sent to you, an EFC that's generated in FA Access or FAFSA on the web. What we're trying to say here is that it should be coming from us and not one that you've calculated by hand or some proprietary software that you possess that would calculate an EFC. If you fail to document, and I don't recommend this, you want to document when you initially calculate a Pell Grant, but if you fail to do it, then we're going to use, and you would use as the default, the later of these dates. The date that the SAR or ICER is first received, not the day you draw it down into your system, but that it's received in your SAIG mailbox, or the date the student enrolls, the later of those 2 dates. And this just says that what I said a second ago, that the date that we're looking at here is the process date on the ICER. That's the date we processed it, as opposed to the date you might have pulled it into your institutional system for administering Title IV. There are mandatory Pell recalculations and there are optional Pell recalculations. Mandatory Pell recalculations, obviously, are required. They are mandated by the regulations, in some instances even the statute. Some examples are when a student's enrollment status changes between a payment period. This is so automatic, we often just do this and don't even think about that we're recalculating the student's Pell. But at the beginning of a 2-semester academic year, we thought the student was going to be full-time, and they are full-time in the fall, and they are 3/4 time in the spring. Obviously, you change their Pell Grant amount because they're not full-time anymore. It's a recalculation, in this case, a mandatory Pell recalculation. You do not have any choice. Similarly, if the student's EFC changes for whatever reason, verification, professional judgment, resolution of conflicting information, the student reporting new data, I didn't mean to say that I made 10,000, I made 110,000. These things happen. That's a mandatory Pell recalculation. And then there's this one. This is my favorite one. The student does not begin attendance in each class that was used to calculate that student's enrollment status. And almost without fail, I will get someone that will either put up their hand to make this announcement, or they'll come up to me after and said, yes, that bullet's a very interesting bullet, but it does not apply to me. because I am at a school that is not required to take attendance. Which I always say, well, that's very interesting. You're quoting me a regulation that has to do with the return of Title IV. And that's not what we're talking about. Regardless if you take attendance or not, it is a Pell requirement captured in the Pell regulations that you must be able to document that a student began attendance in a class, either with attendance records or whatever else you want to use. We don't mandate attendance records. To demonstrate that you said the student's enrollment status was full-time and that the student substantiated that with attendance in at least one class in each class that made up the enrollment status that you used to calculate the student's Pell Grant. Why? Because Pell Grant, along with its sister programs, the Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant and the Teach Grant program, are enrollment status driven. The more enrollment status you have, the more money you will get in those programs. Such is not the case in the campus-based programs or the direct loan program. And yes, I know direct loan has a half-time enrollment requirement, but that's not enrollment status driven. You do not get a significant amount more loan money if you're three-quarter time or full-time. You might get a little bit more because of the difference in cost of attendance, but you're not getting double from half-time to full-time as you would in the 3 grant programs, including Pell. So these are all mandatory Pell recalculations. That's going to be important in our discussion today. I usually don't like to read regulations. They're not the most interesting thing to read. Plus, I train on regulations. I always say, you know, that entertainment value of my training is limited by the authors. You know, I'm not the author of the regulation, mercifully. But this regulation is pretty important, so I'm going to read it here. This is in the Pell regulations, as you can see by that it's in section 690. This is 690.80B, change in enrollment status. And it says the following: if the student's projected enrollment status changes during a payment period after the student has begun attendance, key phrase, after the student has begun attendance in all of his or her classes for that payment period, the institution may, but is not required to, establish a policy under which the student's award for the payment period is recalculated. Any such recalculations must take into account any changes in the cost of attendance. If such a policy is established, it must apply to all students. This is the regulation that allows, I'm sure, the overwhelming majority of you to have a policy in place that says, at some point in the payment period, we lock in an enrollment status on that date or dates, plural. And after that date or dates, we don't change the enrollment status. It's locked in for that payment period no matter what the student does. They can add a class, they can drop a class, what have you. We don't change it. This is the regulation that allows schools to do that. Does it require you to do that? No. But the overwhelming majority of schools do this. The reg continues, but it talks about now mandatory Pell recalculations. The policy that we just talked about talks about optional Pell recalculations, but it's not that it says set up a policy and then you have the option whether to do it or not. The option is whether you have the policy or not and what you put in the policy. That's the optional part. Once you establish the policy, then you're expected, you're actually required to follow your own policy. But this reg shifts a bit and talks about mandatory Pell recalculations, and it says the following: if a student's projected enrollment status changes during a payment period before the student begins attendance in all of his or her classes for that payment period, the institution shall. Notice shall is in dark print. Shall indicates this is a fairly old regulation. It means it's been around a long time. In the early days of Title IV regulation writing, we said shall. Today, we say must. Many people think that shall is a wishy-washy word. And I would point them to the Old Testament where it says, thou shalt not kill. It's not an option. Shall means must. We just don't use shall all that often, but shall means must here. The institution shall recalculate the student's enrollment status to reflect only those classes for which the student actually began attendance. That regulation actually goes on to say, I didn't put it on the slide because I said I don't like to read regulations, and I just did it for 2 slides, so that's my limit. It goes on to say, if you can't document it, you must assume they did not attend, and therefore perform a mandatory Pell recalculation. Some schools choose to have no Pell recalculation policy at all. May I see hands of schools that have that at your school? Hands real high, because I'm seeing none right now. And it doesn't surprise me. I said the overwhelming majority of schools have this policy. In my 24 and 6-month career, I've encountered about 4 schools that did not have a recalculation policy. Those schools that don't have it, they do an initial calculation, and that's all they ever do. They do the initial calculation, and assuming they don't have to do a mandatory Pell recalculation, that's what the student's Pell Grant will be. Some schools choose to have a policy that establishes 1 Pell recalculation date for each payment period. How about if I see hands of schools that have that policy? Quite a few, maybe the majority. You can choose any date you want. Many schools choose to use a census date if you're subject to one. Many schools choose to use their add-drop date if you have one at your school. Most schools do. Sometimes it's the same day as the census date. Many schools don't have a census date. You'll hear a lot of people at the department use the phrase census date to be synonymous with the date you've locked in enrollment, but you're the one that does that, not us. The census date is not a date that is of importance to the U.S. Department of Education. My understanding is that typically it is a date of great importance to your state to which you are reporting some data about enrollment, and the census date is the day you take the census to establish that. It's perfectly all right to use that as the date that you lock in for enrollment status for Pell, but it can be any date you want to choose. It can also be dates, plural, because some schools choose to have a policy that establishes multiple Pell recalculation dates for each payment period. How many people here have that? Do you recommend that to your colleagues? Yes? No? Yeah, I'm seeing nodding heads. It's harder though, isn't it? It's more to keep track of. Again, nodding heads. It's more to keep track of, puts more work on you because there's more to monitor when you have 2 or more dates than when you just had 1. What this would look like, and here you see I'm using a phrase that I invented. This is not going to be found in regulation anywhere, but I call the date that schools choose to lock in the enrollment status for Pell, the Pell recalculation date, meaning after that date, a recalculation will not occur. So the Pell recalculation date here is, they have multiple ones in each payment period, and it's a date that's established in each module, if we're talking about a modular calendar, which we are, that occurs in a given payment period. Because remember, the modules are not payment periods, the modules reside in a payment period. Here's the important thing about multiple PRDs, Pell recalculation dates. Only one PRD is ever applicable to a given student at a given time, and it is based on the latest module or term in which the student attends classes. But here's the fun part. The PRD will change if the student's classes change or his or her attendance changes. So it's not locked in like we typically think Pell recalculation dates are. This can move around depending on what our students do. So let us take a look at some students and their situations. I have a few students to look at. And the first one is attending the University of Casablanca. And UC, which they are known as, has a standard semester term calendar, and it has a 16-week fall, a 16-week spring, and a 10-week summer. Maybe sounds a bit like schools you work at. Fall and spring both have classes that last that entire semester, but they also have classes that last during 2 8-week modules, modules 1 and 2, that reside in those semesters. This school has established a single PRD for each payment period, and they've chosen that day to be the 12th day of each payment period. Again, school's choice whether to even have this policy, and if they choose to have it, what day they choose. UC will not recalculate a student's Pell Grant up or down. That's a requirement. Up or down. It can't be, well, we always recalculate it up, but we never recalculate it down. No, it's a two-way street. They don't recalculate up or down when enrollment changes after the PRD they've established. Everybody clear on UC's policy? Here is Rick. He is a student at the University of Casablanca. His major is hospitality management. He's a Pell recipient. He is a tuxedo-wearing Pell recipient. No, this is not conflicting information. He attends Casablanca University in the fall semester. That semester started on September 1st. Remember, the PRD was set up as September 12th. There's an arrow telling us that's the PRD. On August 31st, the day before the semester starts, he registers for 3 hours in Module 1 of fall and 3 hours in Module 2 of the same payment period, and he begins attendance in Module 1 on the first day of the term. Let's say that Rick drops his Module 1 class on September 14th. Must the Pell be recalculated? If you think it's yes, applaud now. If you think it's no, applaud now. Let us see. Kind of a trick question. I am a federal employee, after all. It does depend. Here's what it depends on. We don't know if Rick is a withdrawn student at this point. The school, in this case Casablanca U, can get written confirmation from Rick that he plans to return for Module 2, and then he would not be a withdrawn student. They cannot just use the registration information that they have that he's registered for the class. They can't use that as written confirmation, but they can get written confirmation from Rick that he's coming back for Module 2 occurring in fall. And if they get that, Rick is not withdrawn. If he doesn't honor the written confirmation, then he would be withdrawn at that time, but we would deal with that at that time. If we don't have written confirmation, then Rick is a withdrawn student, and we would have to do a Pell recalculation now before we do a return, because remember, we said we do Pell recalcs first, then we do a return second. And that might be what we're dealing with Rick here. Because this is a mandatory Pell recalculation, because we used the attendance in Module 2 to come up with Rick's enrollment status, which was 6 hours, which might be half time if 12 is full time. And Rick has not substantiated all 6 hours with attendance. Again, a mandatory Pell recalculation. If Rick is a withdrawn student, CU will first recalculate Pell and then second calculate a return. Let's look at a second scenario. We have our students here, Stephen and Lydia. They are Pell recipients and they attend a school called Skateboard College, and their calendar looks a whole lot like Rick's does over at Casablanca. They're in the fall semester. It starts on September 1st, and there's a PRD of September 12th. There is the PRD. On August 31st, Stephen registers for 3 hours in Module 1 of fall and 3 hours in Module 2 of fall, and he begins attendance on Module 1 on September 1st, first day of the fall term. On August 31st, Lydia registers for the same 3 hours that Stephen has in Module 1. Near the end of Module 1, Lydia finds out Steve is taking 3 hours in Module 2. Lydia thinks Steve is pretty cute. So she is going to take the same class in Module 2 that she finds out Steve is taking, and she registers at that time for the same class that's going to occur in Module 2. Both students begin the class in Module 2 on October 20th. There's the PRD. Must Stephen's Pell be recalculated? If you think the answer is yes, applaud now. If you think the answer is no, applaud now. I got a smart audience here. You guys could give this presentation. The answer is no. Stephen was calculated as a half-time Pell recipient. He had 3 hours in each module, total of 6 hours. He attended Module 1. He attended Module 2. We locked in his half-time enrollment status on September 12th, the PRD. Good to go. What about Lydia? Remember that on August 31st, Lydia registered for the same 3 hours that Stephen had in Module 1, and near the end of Module 1, Lydia found out Stephen is taking 3 hours in Module 2, and she registered for that same class. Both began their class in Module 2 on October 20th. Does Lydia's Pell get recalculated? A means yes, applaud now. B means no. If you think no, applaud now. About half and half. Does Lydia's Pell get recalculated? No. Lydia's Pell was calculated as less than half time. She registered at the beginning of the fall term for 3 hours in Module 1. On the PRD, that's what she had. She later signed up for the class in Module 2, giving her 6 hours, but we do not recalculate her Pell because she added the hours after the PRD that the school established in its policy. They are not allowed to increase Lydia's Pell amount. Stephen and Lydia have a friend. His name's Jorge. He decides to join them in the Module 2 class. Jorge's filled out a FAFSA. He's a Pell recipient. He enrolls in Skateboard College on October the 8th and registers for the 3 hours in Module 2, and he begins attendance in that module on October 20th, along with his friends, Lydia and Stephen. Does Jorge get any Pell for fall? Applaud if you think yes. Applaud if you think no. And I know why you're applauding, because Jorge has started after the PRD. We locked in enrollment on that day. What was his enrollment on that day? We might be wanting to say he had no enrollment on that day or zero enrollment. And as logical as that sounds, that's not correct. And here's why. It's not a recalc. This is Jorge's initial Pell recalculation. And what does the R in PRD stand for? Recalculation. PRDs have nothing to do with initially calculating a Pell. We will do that at any time for any legitimate Pell recipient. And Jorge is eligible for a less than half-time Pell, and he is a happy Pell recipient. Let's look at two other students, Jermaine and Yvonne. They are Pell recipients, and they attend Turquoise Institute in a calendar that looks very much like our other schools. Starts on September 1st. They have 2 modules, but Turquoise has 2 PRDs. Module 1 begins on September 1st, and its PRD is September 12th. Module 2 begins on October 20th, and it has a PRD of November 1st. Here are our PRDs in each module. Remember this, if you have multiple PRDs, it is essential that you remember that only one PRD applies to a student at a given time. You have one student in one term and there's multiple PRDs. Do not think that these multiple PRDs are somehow in play for that student. Now another student could be an entirely different PRD, but again, it will only be one PRD applicable to each student at a given time. The one that you know applies to them is the one that is in the module or the term that has the latest start date and in which the student attends a class. So if the student has a class in Module 2 and attends at least one day in that class, that PRD is going to apply to him or her. If the student doesn't have classes in Module 2 or never attends classes in Module 2, that PRD does not apply to him or her, and the PRD that would apply would be the one in Module 1. PRDs can change if the student's classes change, which presents the challenge to you to monitor when and if that happens. Now remember, our students, Jermaine and Yvonne, they are Pell recipients. They're attending in the fall. Starts on September 1st. There's 2 modules. On August 31st, Jermaine registers for 3 hours in Module 1, 3 hours in Module 2, begins attendance in Module 1 on the first day of the term. The November 1st PRD applies. Why? Because Jermaine has classes out in Module 2. That's going to be the PRD that applies to him. Only one PRD will apply to a given student at a given time. On August 31st, the day before the term starts, Yvonne registers for the same 3 hours that Jermaine has in Module 1. Near the end of Module 1, Yvonne finds out that Jermaine is taking 3 hours in Module 2 and promptly registers for the same class. She learned this from Lydia. Both begin the class in Module 2 on October 20th, leaving only one PRD that's applicable. Does Jermaine's Pell get recalculated? If you think that it does, applaud now. If you think that it does not, applaud now. So let's look at what Jermaine's situation is. We're not going to recalculate Jermaine's Pell. Jermaine was calculated as a half-time Pell recipient. He had 3 hours in each module, 3 and 3, 6. 6 is half-time at this school. We locked in half-time on November 1st, which is the PRD in Module 2, and Jermaine began attendance in all the hours that we used to calculate his Pell, which was 3 hours in Module 1 and 3 hours in Module 2. He attended both modules, at least a day, substantiated the enrollment status with attendance. We document that. We calculated his Pell Grant as half-time. We gave him half-time money. There's nothing to recalculate. Now, Yvonne's a little different. Yvonne originally registered for the same 3 hours that Jermaine had in Module 1. Near the end of Module 1, she found out Jermaine's taking 3 hours in Module 2, and she wanted to be in that class with him, and she registers for that. And she began attendance in that class in Module 2 on October 20th. Does Yvonne's Pell get recalculated? If you think it does, applaud now. If you think it doesn't, applaud now. You are correct. We will recalculate Yvonne's Pell because Turquoise has 2 PRDs. And which PRD applied to Yvonne originally? The first one. But she added this class well into the fall semester, as opposed to Jermaine, who signed up for Module 2 at the very beginning of fall. But Yvonne registered for the second module class right before the second module started. So the first PRD no longer applies to Yvonne because only one will apply at a time, and now the second one will apply to her. So we're going to recalculate Yvonne from less than half-time, which is what she was originally, to half-time, because now she has gone from 3 hours to 6 hours, and she has substantiated that 6 hours with attendance in each class. Multiple PRDs are great. You can always give more money to a student who adds a class, no matter when they add it. But can we? Let us look at my favorite student, Yogi. Yogi enrolls in 12 hours. 6 are in the full semester, and 6 are in Module 1. Catch that? We've got now classes that are spanning the whole semester, the whole 16-week semester, but he's also got some hours, 6, that are only in Module 1. The full semester begins on September 1st and has a PRD of September 12th. Module 1 begins on September 1st and has a PRD of September 12th as well. Module 2 begins on October 20th and has a PRD of November 1st. Does Yogi care about the Module 2 PRD? He does not. He has no classes in Module 2. His classes are either in the full semester or in Module 1, which in the case of this school is the same PRD. Some schools could have a different PRD for the full semester and a different PRD for Module 1. This school's chosen for it to be the same, and that's fine. Yogi's a full-time student. He has 12 hours. He begins attendance in all 12 hours. His PRD is September 12th. Only one PRD is going to apply to a student at a time. We lock in his enrollment status on the 12th. We've paid him full-time money. On September 30th, Yogi drops the 6 hours in Module 1. Thanks, Yogi. And remains enrolled in the 6 hours in the full semester. Remember, that occurred on September 30th. Does Yogi's Pell get recalculated? Applaud now if you think we would recalculate Yogi's Pell. Applaud now if you don't think we would. And you would be right. No, we're not going to recalculate Yogi's Pell. Why? Because the school established a PRD. Yogi was full-time on the PRD. We locked in his enrollment status. We've given him full-time money. He keeps his full-time money. The hours that he dropped occurred after his enrollment status was locked in. A week later, Yogi sees that there is a 3-hour baseball management class that he thinks he might be able to benefit from. And it's being offered in Module 2. And so he goes and enrolls in that class. He begins attendance in baseball management on October 20th. The rest, of course, is baseball history. But what about our concern here about what Yogi has done? Are we going to recalculate Yogi's full-time Pell Grant? If you think we will, applaud now. If you think we will not, applaud now. About half and half. I like that. Very experienced group of people here and difference of opinion on this one. What shall we do? Yogi's Pell Grant gets recalculated. Here's why. Module 2's PRD is now Yogi's PRD. Module 1's PRD, which was Yogi's PRD, no longer is his PRD. Now we are required to monitor Yogi's enrollment status from the beginning of fall all the way up to the second PRD, including every day from the beginning of fall to the second PRD, which is November 1st. On November 1st, what is Yogi's enrollment status? 9 hours. He's got 6 in the full semester, 3 in Module 2 that he just added. Total of 9. He's 3/4 time. We're going to recalculate his Pell Grant, and he's going to get less. Wait a minute, we're going to punish him because he added a class? Yes. I don't like to use the word punish. I like to say we're giving him the correct amount of Pell funds, substantiated by his enrollment status on the date the school established that they would do that. So will multiple PRDs always result in more Pell Grant money for students? Like it did for our student before Yogi, we were able to give her more money. Yvonne, I think her name was, we gave her more money because she added a class, but she was increasing her enrollment status. She benefited from the multiple PRDs. Yogi is decreasing his enrollment status and is having his Pell Grant decreased because of the sequence of events we built into that scenario. But I don't say this for schools with multiple PRDs to stop having them. I imagine in the great majority of cases you are able to accommodate more students who add classes to their enrollment status, especially when they're adding those classes later in the term, typically after the first PRD. But this is a school option. There's no requirement to have multiple PRDs. Again, there's no requirement to have a PRD at all. Totally the school's choice. Thing to remember is that only one PRD will apply to a student at a time, and that can change based on the student's actions. Our last student we'll look at is named Maria. Maria is a Pell recipient, and she attends Central University in the fall. Again, that starts on September 1st and has a PRD on September 12th. Central University only has one PRD. On August 31st, Maria registers for 3 hours in Module 1 of fall and 3 hours in Module 2 of fall, and begins attendance in Module 1 on September 1st. The school packages Maria with a half-time Federal Pell Grant. She's got 6 hours. Here is her PRD. Maria is taking History 101. That is 3 credit hours, and that is offered during Module 1. She has registered for History 102, which is also 3 credit hours, and that's going to be offered in Module 2. After the PRD, which we see here on this slide on the red arrow, Maria decides that she isn't enjoying history, and she drops the History 102 class that was going to occur in Module 2. She replaces History 102 with Geology 101, which is also 3 credit hours, and she attends Geology 101 when it's offered in Module 2. So to recap, Maria has 2 classes, History 101, History 102, total of 6 hours. She attends History 101, and then she drops the second 3 hours, never attends it, doesn't want to attend it, never does attend it. She replaces that class with one she wants to attend, Geology, and she attends it. Does Maria's Pell get recalculated? Remember, Maria got a half-time Pell. If you think the answer is yes, we will recalculate her Pell Grant. Applaud now. And if you think we will not recalculate Maria's grant, applaud now. I think the noes have it, at least in volume of clapping, and no is the correct answer. She was half-time on the PRD. The red arrow is telling us when the PRD was. She was half-time. Enrollment status is that. It is a status of what the student is enrolled. It is not a roster of the classes the student is taking. So Maria was half-time on the PRD. We gave her half-time Pell money. She dropped the class in the second module. Now, if she had never done anything after that, we, of course, would recalculate. She never substantiated her enrollment status with actual attendance. But Maria does substantiate her half-time enrollment status with attendance. It's just attendance in geology. She attends the hours necessary to substantiate the enrollment status we use to calculate her Pell Grant. So her half-time Pell status is still in force. And she does her part by attending a class at least once, which she does. She attended History 101 in Module 1 and Geology 101 in Module 2. So it doesn't matter if it's the same classes that we had on the PRD. We're really looking at the enrollment status that we had on the PRD. A couple of resources for you. We talked quite a bit about Pell recalculations in the Federal Student Aid Handbook. We list the 17-18 handbook here because that is the most recent handbook we have for Volume 3, which is where we would find information about the Pell Grant program, and that's specifically on pages 369, 70, and 71. The new handbook, I am told, I have no inside information, trust me on that, but I'm told will be out very shortly, but do not expect to see differences in the area of Pell recalculation from 17-18 to 18-19. The regulation that we actually read from earlier in the presentation is in the 690 regulations that regulate the Pell Grant program, and specifically in 690.89, where we talk about recalculations. This is the contact information for my friend Greg. He's going to help me with this presentation when we do it in the next 2 days. This is the first time we've done it at this conference. And so you were my guinea pigs. You got me all by myself, and then I'll help Greg tomorrow and the next day. But this is how you can get a hold of us at our respective email addresses and telephone numbers. So we have quite a bit of time here for some questions. Should you have them, we do have 2 microphones. One is in this aisle over on my right, and there's a microphone here directly ahead of me, and there's a microphone over here on my left. So if you'd like to come up to a microphone and ask your questions, we will do our very best to answer them. Let's start here. Sir, on the far left.
Hi. So we have a standard academic year, fall, spring, and we've combined summer 1 and summer 2 to take advantage of year-round Pell. Student signs up for summer 1, summer 2, 3 credits in each semester, in each of those modules.
Right.
They attend summer 1, they don't attend summer 2. That Pell has to go back.
I wouldn't use that phraseology. I would say that Pell has to be recalculated. Bottom line's the same thing, but you're recalculating it to be the true enrollment status of that student, which just sounds like would be 3 hours that they took in summer 1.
Right, because they have to be enrolled half-time to get year-round Pell, so they're not eligible for any Pell.
Oh, I missed what you were saying there. So the student has exhausted their 100% part of the Pell Grant in the fall and spring. They're getting year-round Pell in the summer, which you have combined into one payment period. And the student does not substantiate their half-time enrollment. That is correct. All of that Pell would go back because the student has not met the eligibility requirement for that.
Thank you.
Let's go to this microphone there.
In your last example, does the add and drop have to occur on the same day for that scenario to happen?
In Maria's example,
Yes.
does the add drop have to be what?
Occur on the same day, for example, history and geology?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
My school has decided to do wait list. So sometimes we'll have a student that goes into a wait list status, so they're technically not registered. The PRD occurs, and then after that, the student is then registered in the class. Since we have the student has the intent for the class prior to the PRD, would you be able to recalculate that based on that they were in the wait list prior to the Pell recalculation date?
I'm not following the scenario. So the student is not registered, but they're wait-listed, like waiting for the class to...
An open spot within the course. So the course is full. They go onto a wait list the day before the Pell recalculation date. A student drops the course the day after the Pell recalculation date. That student now is the registration. They are registered in the class, but it's after the PRD.
And you're saying it's the day before the Pell recalculation date or the day after?
It would be, they'd register the day after, but the intent was there prior to by going on a wait list within the institution.
Does the institution consider them enrolled when they're on the wait list?
No, sir.
I think that's
All right.
going to be the problem there.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not saying you could consider them enrolled. I mean, that's not something we regulate, but what we would say is you're looking at enrollment status, and you're the one saying, I'm locking it in on that day, so we would hold you to that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we are a standard term school. We have one Pell recalculation date, even though we have modules in the term.
Okay.
We lock enrollment after we drop for non-payment.
We lock enrollment after?
After we drop for non-payment. So you're registered, our drop ad is very long, so you're registered, you may or may not attend through drop ad, we'll figure that out later. And the day after drop ad, fee payment comes, you don't pay your bill, we clear your schedule, because you didn't pay your bill, so you're not enrolled anymore. And then we lock hours at that point.
And then they lock out?
Then that's our Pell recalculation date, after that purge for non-payment occurs. So we have students who are purged for non-payment that then get their whatever was going on with their aid together and they register for Module 2. It's not their first time being registered for the semester, but as far as financial aid is concerned, it is, but not in real life. So when they register for Module 2, what is their enrollment? Like, is it zero?
I'm hearing you say there is no PRD in Module 2.
There's no PRD in Module 2.
What was their enrollment status on PRD?
It would be zero because they were dropped for non-payment.
I don't think you can help that student.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Hi. Scenario. So we have a semester.
You want to move that mic up just a little for me?
We have a semester, 2 modules, 2 PRDs. We are non-attendance taking. So the student is withdrawn for non-attendance from Module 2. We take the midpoint, which actually falls between Module 1 and Module 2. Because that did not establish their attendance in Module 2, we would not recalculate the Pell.
You would recalculate the Pell because you're dealing with a half-time student who did not substantiate half-time enrollment.
Okay.
They attended Module 1, I'm
Right,
hearing you
so,
say.
So we drop because they never established for the second, we drop that second 6 hours from the Pell.
Well, most of what we talked about in the presentation was about optional Pell recalculations. What you're describing is a mandatory Pell recalculation. The student did not attend a class that you used to calculate their Pell, which is not a bad thing. You didn't do a wrong thing. You did what you were supposed to do. The student didn't attend. What you must do then is a mandatory Pell recalculation to reflect that the student did not attend that second module.
Did not attend, but we're already past the recalc for the first module.
Well, the Pell recalculation date is dealing with optional Pell recalculations. I'm going to say that again. I'm trying to make that how important that is in the presentation. Is mandatory Pell recalculations have nothing to do with your policy. They must be done because we say they must be done. Your policy is not applicable. Your policy is applicable to optional Pell recalculations established in your policy about how you will deal with them. But it assumes that you're dealing with students who are not subject to a mandatory Pell recalculation. You are describing the textbook example of a student subject to a mandatory Pell recalculation. 6 hours, 3 in Module 1, 3 in Module 2. They go to the class in Module 1. They don't go to the class in Module 2. Right. Textbook example of a mandatory Pell recalc that you must do.
Okay, good.
In this case, that might or might not result in a student withdrawal, which would trigger an R2T4. It depends when they dropped the class in Module 2. If they dropped the class while Module 1 was ongoing and then finished Module 1,
right,
it wouldn't be a withdrawal, but it would be a Pell recalculation. That's a
correct,
separate process.
Right.
But if they don't tell you that they're dropping Module 2 and just disappear and don't attend, then it's a Pell recalculation because it's mandatory,
exactly,
and then it's a return of Title IV, and it would be the student earned roughly 50% if you're using the midpoint, or roughly 50% probably if you use the last day of Module 1.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
Can we actually go back to the previous example where the being dropped for non-payment before the Pell recalculation date, and then the student gets back into the classes? Wouldn't that be their initial Pell calculation, as opposed to, because you said you can't help that student if they get back into their classes?
My understanding in that example, and perhaps it was a complicated example, I thought, not that the lady didn't explain it well, she did, but it was complicated to me. My understanding in that scenario was that she had already calculated the Pell and then zeroed it out.
I heard it as
you are
Pell
correct.
date is after the
you are
drop
correct.
in
If you
non-payment.
never calculated a Pell for this student, let's change your scenario a little bit and say that the student signed up for 6 hours, didn't pay. One of the reasons they didn't pay is they never filled out a FAFSA. They didn't have any financial aid. They didn't have any resources of their own. They didn't have a rich aunt to go to. So the school drops them, say your school drops them because they didn't pay you, and then they say, oh wait, I'll take this class in Module 2. Oh, FAFSA? I can do that? They do it on the mobile app. I heard the company line, just like you did.
Nice plug, yeah.
And then the FAFSA's processed, they're Pell eligible. You do the initial Pell recalculation then, and you could pay that student. But we've changed the scenario from what my friend at that microphone described, at least in my opinion. Maybe I didn't hear her right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So we're a school without a Pell recalculation date. And
You do not have a PRD at all?
We do not have a PRD at all.
Were you here when I asked for you to put up your hand? No,
Yes.
I'm just kidding. I
eating
told the
lunch.
crowd here I had 4 schools. I now amend that to 5. Go ahead,
I
ma'am.
was eating lunch, my hands were full. We have a student who withdraws from 2 classes, 6 credit hours in the full term. We do his return to Title IV, Then he decides to register for 2 classes in our second module. Would he be eligible for full Pell at 12 hours or just the 6 hours he's in for module 2?
So the student has 6 hours in module, no,
In
there's
full term.
6 hours in a full term, and the student withdraws
He
from those 6
withdraws
hours,
before module 2 starts.
which constitutes a withdrawal from school.
Right, so we did his return to Title
And you
IV
do return to Title IV, and then the student re-enrolls.
for module 2. So would he be in 6 hours for Pell?
No, you're not going to
purposes
give
or
them
12
6
hours?
more hours. You would reinstate their aid due to the readmission.
So he would still be half-time for Pell
Correct.
purposes? That's what we
Interesting
wanted.
question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Last chance. Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the session. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.